Hello, I'm Stefan from HeyUGuys. I'm joined here today by Harry, and we're going to be giving our video reaction to Steven Spielberg's The BFG. Of course, it's based on Roald Dahl's classic story of the same name, and one that I grew up absolutely adoring. So I was a little bit weary to going into this project, but as expected, Spielberg has knocked it out of the park yet again. What were your thoughts on the movie, Harry?
I really enjoyed how the film was suitable for an adult audience, but also the way it was made still made it relatable to a children's film at the same time. So like the real life animation, we were able to appreciate kind of like from an adult's point of view, and not just watching like, let's say, like animation film which has got loads of toys in it and stuff like that. It was the real life animation made it suitable for both adults and children, and kind of allowed, for me, I felt that it allowed me kind of almost like the escapism of it, kind of like going to that childlike wonder again, because that's what's right in front of you.
And I think one thing we definitely get from this movie, which is something that's relatively new as we kind of move forwards with technology, is you can have a motion capture or performance capture kind of actor, but because it kind of had Mark Rylance's face, we get this subtlety and this kind of nuance in his performance that 10 years ago we probably wouldn't have got. It would have been such a kind of digital creation that we wouldn't really be able to appreciate it as a human. But this felt like Mark Rylance was playing a role in this movie. It didn't feel like a voiceover or anything like that, and he's terrific in the film. And I mean, Ruby Barnhill, who plays Sophie, is just great as well. She's got such a kind of charm to her performance. And do you think that in this movie, despite the fact that it's a big kind of fantasy movie of sorts, I mean, did you think that the performances really stood out? Do you think this is a film that survived in many regards from the kind of quality of the acting?
Yeah, especially with Mark Rylance as the BFG, from the real life motion capture, like you felt proper emotion and a connection towards him, especially at the end with the ending shot. You get a proper connection with his emotions, and because of that real life capture, that you are still able to connect to these characters that are in front of you. And I also thought that Ruby's character, Sophie, was a really strong like female character, even though she was so young, probably about 10 when she was filming at the time. I just thought that her character came across as a really strong, like kind of independent character, and I thought that worked really well with kind of like the dopey side of the BFG, and then this strong little girl who's kind of like almost kind of guiding the BFG to become a better person in that sort of sense.
Yeah, it was really funny. I mean, there were scenes when they were at Buckingham Palace, which are probably my favourite scenes in the movie, and every time he'd kind of say something sort of out of turn, she just kind of put her head in her hands. But I think it sort of represents a sort of device that we've seen in movies and books and across kind of sort of over sort of a century, which is to have a kind of an orphan child in the lead role, and it set the precedence for so many wonderful kind of family stories. And I think it's something that is a tried, tested, and quite a triumphant technique. I mean, obviously we saw it with the Jungle Book earlier in this year as well, and it's such a great character, Sophie, and I think the dynamic between the two roles was just terrific. But I think the one reason why this film works for me and why it is so kind of enchanting is because Spielberg is at the helm. I mean, this is a director who, I mean, my childhood was informed and enriched by his work. I mean, E.T. and film, I mean, even Jaws, which I probably shouldn't have been watching when I was kind of 10 years old, but I was. I mean, when you see a film when you've got Roald Dahl's kind of creative sort of sensibilities combined with Spielberg, you're almost guaranteed a great film. I mean, do you find, I mean, for you personally, is Spielberg something that you feel you've really grown up with, and is Roald Dahl, and were you kind of as excited about this collaboration as I was?
No, definitely. I mean, I was planning on going to see when it first comes out at like the midnight screenings at the local cinema, because like growing up like reading the BFG and all Roald Dahl's work in school, and also even though Spielberg was started slightly before my generation sort of thing, because of our parents, they were kind of like the first sort of films that you'd watch with your family, especially like E.T. That was one of like my favourite films as a child. So then combining one of my favourite authors as a child and one of my favourite directors just in general, combining that together was kind of like a winning combination. And I think that for my generation, for like the late teens, that's something that's going to really appeal to everyone, which is like going to bring us to go and see the film, because we're going to have that connection with not only the director but the storyline as well. And I also feel like Spielberg, the scaling of how he did the characters just complemented the film so well. Like, it didn't look out of place. Like with the animation and stuff like that, it was like you could really appreciate the scale of the giants, but also not so much that they're out of touch and they're just like kind of over the top, so that you kind of just like, oh yeah, okay, it's kind of meh. But because of the scaling of it, you still had a connection with those characters, and I thought that was like one of my favourite parts of the film.
And I also think that one of the reasons why, what kind of ties Spielberg and Roald Dahl together is that they don't talk down to their audience. They treat despite the fact they've made films or they've written books aimed at kind of a young crowd, they treat them with this kind of respect and with a kind of maturity, which I think comes through, because I think kids don't need to be patronised when they go to kind of the cinema or kind of read a story. I think if you treat them with that kind of respect that they deserve, and I think that's something that both of them have always done. But you're right about the way it looked. It was an incredible setup. I think if I had to have a criticism, and this is probably the only criticism because I was a huge fan of this movie, I don't think there was a kind of a good enough threat or antagonist in the film. I never really felt like there was too much that the BFG and Sophie had to overcome. Yeah. I mean, is that something you might agree with? Do you think that was potentially a very small kind of blemish on this film, that there wasn't that sense of conflict, I guess?
Yeah, no, it was kind of seemed almost over the top to something. To me, it felt more of a school ground like argument than like this full scale mass like attack sort of thing. So I thought kind of the kind of narrative structure in that sort of sense kind of was a bit iffy.
The one other kind of talking point about this movie is it hasn't done very well in America. It's sort of box office wise, it's sort of flopped, which is quite interesting, but then at the same time not necessarily surprising, because it's a story that's so steeped in kind of British culture. And I mean, did you? I saw this as a British movie, despite the fact we've got one of the greatest American filmmakers kind of at the helm. But does it surprise you that this has not gone down perhaps as well in America as it will do, hopefully, in England?
I mean, in some aspects, yes, it is surprising, just because of obviously the popularity of Spielberg and kind of like this whole like curation that they've come up with. Like, just I think maybe in America it's kind of looked upon as, oh, it's all in British, like it's got nothing to do with us, so why should we go and watch it in that sort of sense. But I also kind of feel like it's kind of American films have been introducing more British stars and being integrated more with Britain. It started to come across that way, especially like with Star Wars, like lead roles both British. So I kind of feel like it was a bit, I don't understand why it would flop in that sort of sense in America, because they kind of used to this integration of British stars, and there are other films like James Bond. That's a British film, but it still did well in the American box office. So I think maybe because it was a British author of the BFG, that they weren't as familiar with the story, so maybe they wouldn't have been as enticed to go and see it because they didn't grow up with the books and stuff like that. That is like the only reason why I could possibly think why it wouldn't have done as well. But to me personally, I was like, because of the sort of film that it is, I would have thought it would have attracted like all kinds of audiences.
Yeah, you would think that just having a Steven Spielberg film on the top of the poster would be enough to get people to go and see it. But I think that if this film might not do necessarily so well theatrically in the States, I do think that because it's one of those films that has that kind of timeless aspect to it, I think as we progress, I think in 30 years, 40 years time, it will be looked back on as a real kind of classic sort of family movie. I think that it will eventually find a home perhaps on the smaller screen in the States, but I'm sure it will do really well over here. And I think that even though some people might be quite kind of perplexed as to why Spielberg has made a film that is so distinctively British, for me that's just kind of emblematic of a filmmaker who's always done whatever he wants, and a filmmaker that does whatever inspires him. And if it's a British story, then it's a British story, and I think that you can't ever take that away from Spielberg. So I'm just let him do what he wants, I think is really the conclusion to this. Yeah. Overall, this is a really great, very magical piece of cinema, and it's just it's exactly what I hoped and expected it to be. It's a story that I loved as a child, being brought to life by the majestic and the one and only Spielberg. And I think that if you're a fan of Roald Dahl and if you're a fan of Spielberg, which let's face it, you most 100% are, regardless of who you are, then there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that you're going to enjoy this film.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey You Guys, huh?
Hey You Guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yes.
Nice.
Hey